Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this fight that I found very particularly interesting. And of course, this fight, all in all, is going to be, or this video is going to be about that of the Brian Castaño versus Jermell Charlo fight, or maybe his name is pronounced Brian Castaño. I cannot necessarily remember. But Brian Castaño, or Castaño, however you pronounce his name, I believe that he is a fighter that fights out of Argentina. And for those of course that have seen some of the best Argentine fighters, especially within the past several years, we know that Argentina does produce some very tough fighters, very top shelf fighters. Marcos Maidana, of course, was able to give Floyd Mayweather Jr. some hell within his two fights. Lucas Matisse, even though I always thought that maybe he was not as great as some people overall popped him out to be, he gave a lot of people hell. Of course, that was a major challenge for Danny Swift Garcia within the 140-pound division before he ended up defeating him. And then, of course, you also had the great Sergio Maravilla Martinez, I believe, at the 160-pound division, of course, before Miguel Cotto ended his reign when he was a little bit older. But when it comes down to it, all in all, there's a very big fight that is going to be happening, and I believe that now it has been recently pushed back, and instead of happening in February now, I believe that the fight's going to be happening March 17th, March 19th, around that area. I don't really have a big problem with that. I'm not necessarily sure why the fight was pushed back, but I am very excited for this fight because Jermell Charlo and Brian Castaño, in my opinion, they're pretty much on the same level. And I said going into that fight, when it came to Mr. Jermell Charlo and Brian Castaño, I said that Brian Castaño was going to be the biggest challenge and biggest test of Jermell Charlo's career. And I was right on the money. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a person that likes to brag about how I'm this Nostradamus or anything like that because none of us get every single prediction right. But I did know that Brian Castaño was going to be a very tough challenge for Jermell Charlo. I've seen him fight a multitude of times. He was able to beat up that one Brazilian fighter, I believe, by the name of Patrick Teixeira, who in my opinion was somewhat of a weak champion, but it is what it is. Brian Castaño was able to completely blast through him. He was able to get a draw with that of Araceli Lara. In my opinion, Lara probably should have threw more in that fight, but it is what it is. Brian Castaño, at the end of the day, was able to get a draw with him, and even if you're able to get a draw with Araceli Lara, that does prove all in all that you do have some boxing ability. And then, of course, this big fight with Mr. Jermell Charlo happened last time, and to be quite honest with you, I think that Jermell Charlo was very fortunate to get out of this fight with the decision. It just is what it is. Personally, I thought that he probably should have lost this fight. If you're asking me what would I have scored the fight, I probably would have scored it 7 rounds to 5, or maybe even 8 rounds to 4 for Brian Castaño. I just did not think that Jermell Charlo did enough in the fight. He did hurt him a few times later on in the fight, but I just thought that Brian Castaño, not only did he hurt Jermell Charlo several times as well in the fight, but on top of that, I just thought that he landed more. I thought that he got the more impactful punches in there. But of course, Jermell Charlo, he is the A side. He is the person that is worth more money. He was the A side heading into this fight. So I would not be surprised if Jermell Charlo does somehow get a decision coming into this second fight. But we'll see all in all what happens. I am going to be very excited for this fight. With both of these fighters, they're going to have to put on a performance like they never have before in their career in this second fight. Both of their careers are really on the line at this point in time, and I'm going to be very excited. Anyways, we're going to see what Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation has to say about it. Let's tune in.
Jermell.
And of course, Dante's Boxing Nation, like usual, only shows when Brian Castaño got hurt in the fight.
You obviously hurt him pretty badly in the 10th round. How close do you feel?
On the 10th?
Well, that was the most obvious time.
Obvious the second or when? Like, I feel like I heard him more than 3 times. Yeah. I seen him. His legs walk every time. Well, go ahead. My bad.
How close do you feel you were to getting him out of there at that point?
These dudes are sure hellified confident and so damn cocky for what they've really accomplished in boxing. And I'm talking about both these brothers. Because Jermell Charlo, to be quite honest with you, he probably clearly should have lost that fight. Don't get me wrong. I thought that there was a few times that he was able to hurt Brian Castaño as well. But like I said, come on, man. That was a very competitive fight. He's trying to act like he dominated the fight. Like, get out of here.
Point. And did you feel he was still hurt in the beginning of the 11th round?
Of course, that's what I'm saying. So, I went into to the 10th round, he was, like belligerent all over the ring, like barely could stand up. I don't know. I just couldn't get him out of there. You know what I'm saying? The dude was tough. He was tough as fuck. You know what I'm saying? And that's what I wanted. I wanted a warrior. I faced the warrior, and I knew what I was gonna get in there with. Undefeated fighter. Come on, this is not something that everybody looking at it like.
This is why Jermell Charlo, in my opinion, cannot be on my top 10 pound for pound list, not unless he were to completely unify that 154 pound division. There's no offense against Jermell Charlo, but, so many of these channels, especially, that play the victim mentality, and don't get me wrong, like I said, are there double standards against black fighters? Absolutely, yes, there can be. But don't sit here and say that, oh, well, the reason why Jermell Charlo isn't put on the top 10 pound for pound list is because all in all, he's a black fighter. No, he's not put on the top 10 pound for pound list because Jermell Charlo, when you take a look at every category, once again, I just released my top 10 pound for pound list yesterday. I rank off of 4 categories. Let's talk about the 4 categories that I rank by. First of all, let's not even, go in the resume first because, I can basically pick that apart. Let's even talk about skill set. Now, so many of these channels like Champside or maybe another channel, they may say, well, I have Duran Boots Ennis or Steven Fulton or Shakur Stevenson on my top 10 pound for pound list because they're so highly skilled, and what can Tyson Fury and these other fighters do that, overall that is better than them? Well, a question should be asked about Mr. Jermell Charlo as well. What can Jermell Charlo really do that is better than a lot of fighters out there? Because he certainly doesn't have better head movement or better footwork overall than a majority of fighters out there. It just is what it is. Or he doesn't have better foot speed. He's very, very stiff when it comes down to it. It's the same thing with Jermell Charlo when it comes down to it. On top of that, he's not someone that throws a whole lot of punches. He is not an A-plus skilled fighter. He just isn't. I think both Brian Castaño and Jermell Charlo, they're on a very similar level. That's why the fight was so competitive, at least somewhat when it came down to it. Both of them are on that A- level. For example, if they were to face Canelo Alvarez next, I would not even give them a 20% chance. It just is what it is.
Shit, I fought a hard fighter. Yeah.
You take a look at that. You see that jab that Brian Castaño just landed? Both Jermell Charlo and Jermell Charlo have a very, very big problem with head movement. It just is what it is. They've always had a problem with it. They've never had a great head movement. Go ahead and take a look at Jermell Charlo with his fight against Austin Trout, also his fight against Matt Korobov. Just why I say, I don't know where people get this narrative where Jermell Charlo is this big, huge threat to Canelo and all. Don't get me wrong. He's a very good fighter. Very good fighter. But don't sit here and tell me that he's this slickster and he's like he can be compared to Floyd Mayweather Jr. Jermell Charlo is not even on the same level as the primary Sonny Laura. Just come on, man.
Jermell Charlo, he fought a very, very tough champion for all of the belt.
And on top of that, when it comes to Jermell Charlo, like I said, let's talk about the top 10 pound for pound thing just continued. The reason why he's on no one's top 10 pound for pound list, at least anyone that's logical and objective, is because, first of all, when it comes down to it, you have that loss against Tony Harrison. And, people want to say, well, why doesn't he get credit for beating Tony Harrison? Tony Harrison, listen, like I said, Jermell Charlo is at the peak point in his career, and he lost to Tony Harrison. Tony Harrison is a B to C class fighter. You're talking about a dude that lost every big fight in his career by knockout. He lost to this one random dude. I don't even remember what the hell his name was. I think his name was like Willie Nelson or some shit. Then overall, he ends up losing to Jarrett Hurd. He may have even lost to someone else when it came down to it. He beats Jermell Charlo and gives Jermell Charlo hell in the second fight. So skill set wise, Jermell Charlo, I don't even know if he has an A- skill set, to be quite honest with you. He has about a B+ skill set. I would say that he's an A- fighter when you talk about his athleticism, but he don't have an A-grade skill set. It just is what it is. He don't have it. That's why he's not on the top 10 pound for pound list. And he shouldn't be. Not unless he were to completely unify that 154 pound division. And even if you want to talk about his resume, who on Jermell Charlo's resume is really, really that good? Is it Rojas? That one fighter who knocked out Julian J. Rock Williams? Don't get me wrong, he's okay, but he's not great. Is Erickson Lubin a world beater? No. When it comes down to, the best fighter that Jermell Charlo has ever fought, all in all, is Brian Castaño. That is the best fighter that he's ever fought, and it was a fight that he probably should have lost. So it is what it is.
Which is how boxing is supposed to be. The best fighting the best. Not only did Jermell Charlo find out how tough Castaño was, but after he found out, he's willing to do it all over again. And this will not...
I give you a lot of credit. When it comes down to it. Jermell Charlo, I'm rooting for both fighters in this fight. I think that both of them have the opportunity to pull it out. Who do I believe is more skilled of the two? I think that they're about on the same level. If you're asking me personally who I think is a little bit more skilled, I would say Brian Castaño, just because I think he's a little bit more defensively responsible and, he seems to have a little bit of better head movement, but he does need to improve it a little bit because a lot of the times Jermell was able to counterpunch him a little bit later on, and Brian Castaño, he did get caught. So we'll see what happens.
Be an easy fight for Jermell Charlo to win. Matter of fact, I just watched the fight over the other night because Castaño is so short and compact and he wastes no punches. Even though he's always coming forward, he will not throw a punch until he is in a perfect position, and it's more of an ambush attack where he jumps on you so quick it's hard to catch him with a counter. It's important to note Castaño is not Mexican, he's Argentinian, and they have some of the smartest Latino fighters in the game. Most of them usually have an intelligent, aggressive style. Like I said, they don't waste punches, they don't telegraph their punches. They're not just throwing a whole bunch of punches and bunches to where you could set them up with so many different counter punches, like a Miguel Burchell, an Oscar Valdez, or an Averati. Those are...
Now, what are all the fighters that he just listed off there? Were those fighters Argentinian? Were they Puerto Rican? Were they Honduran? Those were Mexican fighters. But what is Dante's Boxing Nation always trying to say? Especially about Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez. Oh, Saul Canelo Alvarez, he won't even face the best Mexican fighters. Some of these Mexican fighters, don't get me wrong, they can be very talented. But like I said, there's different leagues of Mexican fighters. Canelo Alvarez is one of those all-time skilled and all-time great Mexican fighters. To be honest with you, he's probably the most talented Mexican fighter that I've personally ever seen. Because there's a lot of Mexican fighters out here that they just go and they're just another David Benavidez, where they just like to pressure you and they're very straightforward, don't have overall the greatest of feet, don't have the greatest of head movement, don't have a great defensive responsibility. That's why usually when they face a very slick fighter like a Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker or a Floyd Mayweather Jr., they don't usually always do too well. It just is what it is. Canelo, in my opinion, is a different breed. Now, sure, he still lost to Floyd Mayweather Jr., but he didn't lose to Floyd Mayweather Jr., in my opinion, because he's not as skilled overall as some of the other guys that Floyd fought. He just lost to him, in my opinion, because I just think Floyd, when it comes down to it, he just has that type of style. But at the end of the day, like I said, Argentine fighters, they are very, very tough, but you have to take a look at the individual opponent. And Brian Castaño, he is a very, very decent threat.
Some of the easiest styles to figure out compared to...
If we're also talking about Oscar Valdez actually, in my opinion, he's actually one of the more talented Mexican fighters out there as well. Would I necessarily favor him to beat that of Shakur Stevenson? I'm not so sure about that, but he's very talented. That kid can box.
Castaño. So anyway, this fight was supposed to be scheduled for February 26th. Now it's being pushed back to either March 12th or March 19th. It's a little unfortunate because we got this dry spell right now where there are no big fights, and now we're going to have to wait a couple more weeks to see one of the biggest fights of the year, at least one of the biggest fights of the first quarter of 2022. Meanwhile, while you have fighters like Castaño, Charlo, Terrence Crawford, Devin Haney, Shakur Stevenson, all of these guys are looking for the most dangerous opponents to face. While Canelo Alvarez, he's over here moving up and playing with teddy bears. But the good news is out.
Playing with teddy bears. Caleb playing. Once again, it's no coincidence that when Billy Joe Saunders and Demetrius Andrade was announced, that he said that it was a super fight. But with Canelo, it's teddy bears. It is. Once again, I wonder what were to happen if Canelo were to face Brian Castaño next. Would Dante's Boxing Nation say that that's an A-grade fight, or would he say that Canelo's cherry picking?
Outside of Canelo Alvarez, we're going to see a lot of 50-50 fights, competitive fights, where we don't know how the fights are going to play out. Once again,
the only fights that Canelo Alvarez can take, in my opinion, where I don't know how the fight is going to play out. I guess, there is no 100% certainty with any fight out there. Any fighter could potentially beat any fighter. But the only fights, in my opinion, that Canelo can take where I probably don't already know the outcome is either a Dimitri Bivol or Tibita. Why? Because those guys, all in all, they have decent boxing skills for their division. And on top of that, they have A-grade power. Jermell Charlo, I think, is very talented, but like I said, I've already listed off all these guys as, problems in my opinion and why they're not going to beat Canelo. Once again, that doesn't mean that I don't want to see the fights, but to me, spreading the narrative that they're the biggest threats towards Canelo, I just don't think that would be the truth. Jermell, he has a lot of the same problems that Jermell has. Very stiff, doesn't have a great head movement, doesn't have the fastest feet. And if you don't have fast feet, you're not going to beat Canelo. You don't have a chance against Canelo. Unless, all in all, you're a very skilled fighter and you're a person, all in all, that's a very decent counter puncher, like a Gennady Golovkin. Gennady Golovkin, he doesn't have the fastest feet, but he actually does have very decent feet. He can cut off the ring very, very well. And on top of that, his power is on a whole nother level usually compared to anyone else. Jermell Charlo is not going to be able to pressure Canelo and just completely bully him around. He's not going to be able to do that. It just is what it is. He's too stiff. Overall, Canelo Alvarez has somewhere on the same level, same power as Jermell when it comes down to it, and he's too slick. He's too good. His movement is too good. Overall, his feet may even be faster than that of a Jermell's when it comes down to it. I just don't see how Jermell Charlo beats Canelo. I just don't see it. When you talk about Demetrius Boo Andrade, he, in my opinion, has a better chance than that overall of a Jermell Charlo. Once again, I just think that he gets a little bit too sloppy, but I still would like to see that fight. And when you talk about a David Benavidez, once again, he has the size over Canelo, but he don't have that A-grade power. He leaves his chin way too open, in my opinion, and on top of that, does not have A-grade defense. All those fighters, in my opinion, pretty much get ate up by Canelo Alvarez. The only one that I would have a little bit of a question about is maybe Demetrius Boo Andrade. That would be it.
Comes to Canelo, we already know how the fight is going to play out. It's like the WWE, it's already scripted. He's going to fight Makabu, and because Makabu has no rhythm, no speed, no defense, no foot movement, no chin, mark my words, that fight will not go more than 3 rounds. It will look...
The reason why Dante's Boxing Nation is saying that is because he always likes Canelo Alvarez to look bad in whatever prediction that he's putting out there. He did the same shit with Sergey Kovalev and Billy Joe Saunders. He basically said, well, Canelo should dominate this fight. He should dominate this fight when he's facing legitimate champions. Don't get me wrong, Ilunga Makabu, in my opinion, or Makabu, however you pronounce his name, he's not someone that's A-grade, but he is decently bigger. So that's why it's going to be interesting. And like I said, go and take a look at his highlights. It's not like this dude is a cupcake like what Juan Macias Montiel was for Jermell Charlo. And Jermell Charlo completely underwhelmed in that performance.
Just like the Yildirim fight, it will look just like the Rocky Fielding fight. The only question now...
I think that Canelo Alvarez more than likely will stop Ilunga Makabu because I do think that his power is going to translate there. But I think that it's going to be somewhere around the 7th or 8th round. But we'll see what Makabu has in store.
Is there a network that's bold enough to host that fight? We'll see. But when it comes to real competitive...
Of course it is. It's Canelo Alvarez. Canelo Alvarez could fight a dog turd, and the fight would probably sell. It just is what it is.
Fights like this one right here.
And I'm not saying that overall as a fanboy or anything like that. All I'm saying is that I know which fighters can sell. And it depends overall which fights are going to be competitive. And Canelo Alvarez trying to make history at cruiserweight, I don't know if it'll do 900,000 pay-per-view buys like the Caleb Plant one did, but I could see it doing around 500,000 pay-per-view buys. We'll have to see what happens.
With Charlo and Castaño, you cannot predict how the fight will play out because it's too competitive of a fight. It can play out many different ways. The first fight, we seen Charlo get hurt for the first time. I've never seen him get hurt like that, but he bounced back extremely fast. He got caught with a hook. He kind of did a little bit of a dip with his knees, but he was right back in the fight. But in return, Charlo, he hurt Castaño multiple times in the fight.
Castaño, from what I've seen, he was also able to hurt Jermell multiple times as well. But we'll see what happens in this rematch.
So I think because of that, that obviously gives Charlo a lot more confidence going into the rematch. Castaño, he fought the perfect fight. Like I said, he was aggressive, but he didn't waste any punches. You never really knew when he was about to attack. And then when he did attack, all you could really do is block. You look for a counter, but Castaño, he does it so quick, he's in and out. And he smothers you when he's throwing his punches as well. He stays so close to you, you don't have leverage a lot of times to catch him with a counter shot. And this is what I noticed. I noticed last night because I watched Charlo Castaño, and then I started to watch a little bit. I didn't watch the whole thing again, but I went back to watch Lara versus Castaño. And it turns out Lara did better. than Charlo did against Castaño.
No shit. You know why that is? Because Araceli Lara is an all-around better fighter than what either Charlo brother were. I've been saying this for the whole entire time. For those of you overall that have been watching my videos, I've said this for the longest time. A prime Araceli Lara is better than what a prime Demetrius Andrade or either Charlo brother ever were. Better feet, better defensive responsibility, better timing, better speed when it comes down to it. Overall, better counter-punching ability, better in every single one of those categories. Just was.
Lara, he knew how to control the distance. He was using all of these feints. He was setting him up with a lot of jabs. The jabs was
The only problem with Araceli Lara in some of his bigger fights, just like it can be a problem with multiple Cuban fighters, just like Guillermo Rigondeaux and even Frank Sanchez now from what I'm seeing, sometimes they don't dare overall to throw enough sometimes in some of the bigger fights. Sometimes they can be a little bit too defensive, which can lose you a fight.
setting up perfect left hands all night for Lara. Jermell, he's going to have to use a lot more feints, and he's going to have to get off first. Because what was happening is, once
I agree. And in my personal opinion, if you're asking me who am I favoring in this fight, I'm going to favor that of Jermell Charlo. And a certain amount of people overall may say, well, why would you favor him? Because Brian Castaño, in my opinion, even though I thought that he didn't have to win the first fight, I think that he respects Jermell Charlo a little bit too much. And I think that a big part of the reason overall why he was not able to pull out the clear victory, sure, do I think that the judges were on Jermell Charlo's side? Sure. Because boxing is just like that. But whoever's the A side, if it's a competitive fight, the A side is going to get the benefit of the doubt. It just is what it is. That's what happened with Canelo and Gennady Golovkin in the first fight. But when it comes down to all in all, bottom line is this. I just think that Brian Castaño, I think that he felt Jermell Charlo's power. And I think all in all that he's going to give him a little bit too much respect. And I don't know if he's going to throw as much in the second fight as what he did in the first. But I hope that I'm wrong. I hope overall that he at least puts on the best performance possible. But we'll see.
again, Jermell was expecting Castaño to be overly aggressive and leave himself open for counters, and that's not what happened.
Because that's not the fighter that Brian Castaño is. Brian Castaño is a person that can counter you very well on the inside. He's very speedy, and he always has his hands up. And Jermell Charlo is not used to facing fighters that have that type of boxing ability. Like I said, I hope Brian Castaño, and listen, this is not me saying that I'm cheering for Brian Castaño. I don't have a horse in this race. Like I said, I'm not a fan of any of these fighters. Of course, that doesn't mean that, I may not root for certain people here and there. But I'm really hoping that these two boys put on the best fight possible. I'm really hoping that this isn't going to be a Devin Haney, Jojo Diaz type of thing to where, Brian Castaño fights scared the whole entire time because he's afraid of getting hit with a counter. So we'll see what happens.
So Charlo will find himself waiting for Castaño to get off so Charlo could try to counter. But in the rematch, he's going to have to be on his front foot a lot more. He's going to have to keep the fight in the center of the ring, and every once in a while, he's going to have to be able to back up Castaño, which won't be that easy.
I agree.
So it'll be a fun...
And Castaño, from what I noticed in that fight, he didn't always necessarily fight on the back foot extremely well. So Jermell Charlo, it would be in his best interest, in my opinion, to probably try and back up Brian Castaño. And Jermell Charlo, these guys actually, they have somewhat of similar faults because neither of them overall really fight that extremely well in the back foot.
And once again, it's a 50-50 fight, but this is a huge win for the winner because they become undisputed. And when I say undisputed, I don't mean in the weakest division like Canelo did at 168, where he purposely...
That division, all in all, Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, Callum Smith, all those fighters for those weight divisions, maybe not Callum Smith, but Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant, in my opinion, they're at least around the same talent level, if not even more than that overall what a Brian Castaño is. It just is what it is. Don't get me wrong. Or what a Jermell Charlo is. It just is what it is. That's why, once again, so many people, they say, oh, well, Canelo, he needs to face Charlo. I would love to see that fight, but this is my personal opinion. Now if you want to argue that Andrade was a bigger threat, than those guys, I don't have a problem with that. But Jermell, I just don't see it. He's too stiff. Now, of course, Billy Joe Saunders and Caleb Plant, they don't have the power of what a Jermell Charlo has. But what does it really matter if you don't really have, the technique in order to really compete with that other guy? It just is what it is.
Void become undisputed or attempting to become undisputed at 154 and 160. He looked for the easiest champions, and then
Let me say this. Had Billy Joe Saunders that fought Canelo Alvarez that night, If that same Billy Joe Saunders would have fought Jermell Charlo even at his best, I don't even know if Jermell Charlo would have beat that version of Billy Joe Saunders. I don't know if he would have beat the best version of Caleb Plant or Billy Joe Saunders. He may beat him now that they're knocked out by Canelo, but I'm not sure if he would have beaten him previously.
Elected belts. It's not easy at 154. There are no easy fights at 154. So this is going to be a huge accomplishment to become undisputed in one of the deepest divisions.
I don't know why overall he always says that this division is so deep. Who is there? Who really is there all in all to claim that this is one of the deepest divisions in boxing? All of the champions that Canelo Alvarez fought there, and once again, I'm not this person that is just fanboying or fangirling over Canelo, but let's just state the facts. Canelo all in all fought Callum Smith, who was a Ring Magazine champion, an undefeated fighter that knocked out George Groves, even though he was a bit older. He beat Billy Joe Saunders, who was a multiple weight division champion, undefeated, had some decent wins in his career. He beat Caleb Plant overall, who had a very impressive performance over Jose Uzcategui, who knocked out one of the Durrell brothers, who was a former champion there. So this is what I'm saying. You know, people take a look at it. There's nothing easy at 154. What are you talking about, dude? Who the hell is there? Tony Harrison ain't an elite champion. You know, when it comes down to Erislandy Lara is pretty much washed up. Erickson Lubin is not a world beater. He's not going to defeat anyone elite when it comes down to who is there. You know, Jason Rosario is not that good of a fighter. Who the hell is there besides Castaño and Jermell Charlo overall that is really that elite? No one. There's no one there that is that good.
In the
And
game.
don't even get me started on Julian overall paper mache Chin Williams. And don't even get me started on him.
Today. Let's see how it plays out. That's all I got for now, guys. On to the next one. Let me tell you guys about this.
Anyways, that's really about it for this video. But I just thought that would be very, very interesting. But anyways, overall, I would like to know who you guys personally think is going to win this fight. Who do I personally think, who would I favor at the current moment in time? Probably Mr. Jermell Charlo. But we'll see all in all what happens. Just because I think Brian Castaño, unfortunately, from what I've seen in that last fight, I believe that he respects Jermell Charlo's power a little bit too much. But I wouldn't be surprised, you know, if with a man overall were to pull out of that fight. But we'll see all in all what happens. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.